Positions for Analysis, read and written by Michael Basman. Please set up the position in diagram 1 on your boards and analyze it. It's white to play. Switch off the tape, and when you've done your analysis, switch back on and compare your thoughts with mine. This first position is a one-move win. White simply plays one white queen to c3 and will win the rook on h8, which will give him the advantage. He was a piece down previously. The surprising thing about the position is that I showed it to a couple of grade 150 players, and they were unable to find the right move. I think when you ask someone to solve a position, his playing strength often deteriorates, and he is unable to find moves that would have been easy for him over the board. Also, when playing a game, there's a familiarity acquired from the previous moves, which is lacking when you come fresh to a position. So if you fail to spot Queen c3, then spend a certain amount of time familiarizing yourself with the subsequent positions before trying to do any hard analysis. In this particular position, there's another reason why Queen to c3 is hard to spot. White's pieces are piled up on the KB file, and it's natural to expect a denouement along that line, rather than along the black central diagonal. The game continuation, after white queen to c3, was black pawn to f6, white knight takes on f6 check, black king to d8, knight went back to d5, black captured on d5 with the bishop, white recaptured, pawn takes on d5, and black played queen takes d5. White moved rook on a1 to d1, stopping the black queen check at d4, and black resigned. Now please turn to diagram 2 and set up that position on your boards and start to analyze. It's black to move. You might have thought that white was doing well here. In fact, he is not. He has a passed king's rook pawn and a rook on an open file, threatening to win material with a rook to g8 check. But black has a better central position, and this will tend to turn the game in his favor. Did you choose for black castle's queenside or king to e7? Castle's queenside looks attractive, as there is a threat of discovery against the white king. Now let's look at that. Castle's queenside for black. However, in this position, white has rook to g7, and the king's bishop's pawn begins to look a bit sickly. Naturally, black does not really want to move it, because this will increase the scope of the white rook along the 7th rank. So, after rook to g7, black could go knight to c5, discovered check. Then white could play king to c2. Then if black defended his pawn on f7 by rook to d7, white could simply move knight to f6, and then he could follow up by advancing his king's rook pawn. In that particular position, the king's rook pawn would look a very dangerous threat. So, if you'd return your pieces to diagram 2, switching off if necessary, we'll look at the actual game continuation. So, from diagram 2, we've decided that black's king is needed in the center to guard the KB pawn, and also to be ready to catch the king's rook pawn, the H pawn, if it tries to get through. So let's play that move, king to king 2. Now another question. After black king to king 2, king to e7 if you use algebraic, if white plays rook to g7, how would you then continue? Switch off here and consider your answer. Black's sharpest reply to white rook to g7 is knight to c5, getting the piece out of the way. If then white plays knight to g5, attacking the f-pawn, then black king to f6 forks the rook and knight, a not unusual occurrence in such endgames. If white plays here rook takes f7 check, then king takes g5, of course. So let us return again to diagram 2. That will be with the black king on e8, black knight on d7, white knight on h7, and the white rook on g1. No other pieces have moved. And we'll see how the game continued. Black went king e7, white pawn to h4, black knight to c5, white knight to g5, black rook to d8 check, white king to e2, black pawn to f6, white knight retreats to f3, black knight back to e6. Black has centralized his forces, and white dared not advance his h-pawn further for fear of losing it. For example, if pawn to h5, then black just plays knight to f4 check. White, I think you will agree, had a difficult position here. Now let's move on again. This time turn to position 3, diagram 3, and set it up on your boards. Switch off if necessary to do so, and then start analyzing. It's black to move in this position. This is a rather unusual looking position. Neither king's castled, and queens and bishops seem to be stuck on edges of the board. It's perhaps in some ways a misleading position as well, though it does happen to be susceptible to concrete analysis, something that cannot be said of most positions. Now, an obvious move here, which you might have chosen, is black knight to b4, knight to b4. This aims to attack directly with the knight, perhaps even to pick up the a-pawn. After knight to b4, white moves rook to c7. And I'd just like to ask a quick question here. How would you reply if black played king to d6 in this position? The answer in this case is white knight to c4 check, forking king and queen. And if black plays pawn takes knight, then white queen to c5 is mate. Of course, White had other moves, but this was the strongest. Now let's return to diagram 3, adding the moves knight, black knight to b4, and white rook to c7. In this position, black knight to d3 check comes to nothing. White simply plays bishop takes knight. Another possibility with the knight is to play knight takes rook's pawn. Now, please switch off here and decide your continuation for white in this position. Well, unfortunately for white, rook takes bishop check isn't a good answer. Black would simply take the rook, and after white checks on f7, black can bring his queen back to e7, blocking the attack. Instead of rook takes bishop check, white does have rook takes knight's pawn, that is, rook takes on b7. Then if black plays queen to c1 check, white moves king to e2, black knight to c3 check, white king to d3. You'll notice in this position how the white knight at d2 effectively stops the black queen from giving any useful checks. This is another middle game motive which turns up now and then and is useful to remember, that a king and a knight can often defend well against a queen. I'd like you to reset some of the pieces now, and we'll look at another possibility after black knight takes on a2. That requires the white king to go back to e1, black queen back to a3, put the black knight on a2, the white rook on c7, and a black pawn on b7. Possibly white's best against knight takes pawn is queen to g6. This threatens the g pawn, which cannot be guarded by king back to f8, because white would simply play rook takes bishop. So black would have to go king to d6, when white could reposition his queen by queen to c2 with good attacking chances. So I think this analysis shows that knight to b4 is a bit risky and offers white quite good chances, even if it does win black a pawn. So let's return again to diagram 3, and we'll see the other possibilities for black. In this position, you might have chosen king to f8, which looks a bit grovelling, but white would probably play bishop to g6 there, and you're in even a worse mess because of the threat of queen to h8 check. If you were still worried about your king side, you might have chosen bishop to e8 to try and drive the white queen away. And this is perhaps possible, because if the white queen moves back to g4, then you have pawn to g5, which just about works. Finally, you may also have chosen pawn to f5 to try and trap the bishop on h7. But this is positionally very dubious because of the weaknesses it gives you on the black squares at g5 and e5. If, from diagram 3, black played pawn to f5, I would expect white to play pawn to g4 and keep his check in hand. Now the actual move played from diagram 3 was black rook to h8, which leads to a false win of material due to the threat of black bishop to e8. White queen moves back along the h-file, and then black bishop to g6, winning the bishop due to the pin. The cruel part in this game comes when white answers queen to g6 in reply to black's rook to h8. How would you continue for black were white to play that move? That is, from diagram 3, black plays rook h8 and white plays queen to g6. Switch off here. Black plays king to f8, leaving white as embarrassed as ever over his queen and bishop. For example, if he moves his queen back to d3, white queen to d3, black plays queen takes on d3, white bishop takes on d3, black knight to b4, white rook to c3, guarding the bishop, black knight takes on d3 check, white rook takes on d3, black rook to h1 check, white king to e2, and now black bishop to b5, which will win the exchange, and after that the white knight is no match for the rook in the endgame. So score full marks if you notice this crushing maneuver. Let's return to the actual game and see what happened from diagram 3, if you'd like to reset that position. The actual game continuation from diagram 3 was black rook to h8. White played pawn to g4, thinking he'd escaped from black's maneuver. Black played bishop to e8. White queen back to h2. Now, of course, if black plays bishop to g6, white will move in with queen to c7 check, and he in fact wins that position. Still, black has better. Instead of playing bishop to g6, he moved his queen back to d6. And this wins material after all, because if white plays queen takes d6 check, black plays king takes on d6, and now the white bishop got nowhere to go except d3, after which knight to b4 will win material as in the previous variation. A word in general here about analysis. I used to find when analyzing positions by myself or with friends that I would soon wander off, that is, my hands would wander off and start making moves automatically on the board as though I were playing a game, so that shortly the position arising on the board would be down to bare kings and pawns and had obviously nothing to do with the original position. I don't do that so much now. I don't think in analyzing you should necessarily stop yourself from moving the pieces around the board, but it is important that you should learn to keep a balance between moving and thinking. Besides this, I think it's important to avoid straining the brain too much trying to understand positions or trying to find good moves. Finally, if you find yourself becoming bored, depressed, frustrated, annoyed while working on the position, this should also be watched, because it stops you analyzing properly. I imagine that such reactions are more common than is generally allowed for among teachers and book writers, who generally assume that the pupils they have to deal with are perfect, when this isn't always the case. Now let's turn to diagram number 4, position 4. It's black to move here. There are no crushers because they've hardly got out of the opening. But what move would you choose for black in this position? Switch off and begin to analyze. Well, black has a nice looking game with white's pawn at d3, a sickly creature. He played to occupy the queen 5 square by moving his knight from c6 to d4. Perhaps actually pawn to h6 was a little better, since after knight to d4, white moved bishop to g5. Black blocked this with pawn to f6. Clearly, if his queen moves, then white knight comes in onto f6 with check. So black played pawn to f6, white retreated, bishop to e3, black pawn to f5, white knight to g5. Now in this position, black could find nothing better than knight takes on b3, white queen takes on b3, once again attacking the e6 square, and now black knight to d5, white knight takes on d5, black queen recaptures on d5, white queen takes on d5, black pawn takes on d5. And now, as white's b pawn is attacked, he played rook on a1 to b1. You might care to study this position and decide once more on a continuation for black. It's diagram 5 in case you want to move any pieces around. Now, first of all, we had better decide what is to be avoided for black in this position. Should he play pawn to h6, driving the knight away, white retreats knight back to f3, and then if, say, pawn to pawn to f4, white will simply occupy the d4 square, white bishop to d4. After black bishop takes on d4, white knight recaptures on d4. In this position, with the white knight occupying a firm outpost in the center, black could even be a bit worse. Now let's return to diagram 5. With the last variation in mind, this might make the game continuation from diagram 5 comprehensible, if not excusable. Black played pawn to d4, white bishop retreated to d2, and black moved pawn to h6. White knight went back to f3. Well, of course, white is unable now to put anything on d4, but at the same time the pawn on d4 does block the action of the bishop on g7. So it's a question of swings and roundabouts. Now after white's knight went back to f3, black moved bishop to e6, white pawn to b3. And in this position, turned out that black was unable to obtain any advantage because white was able to attack down the e file by moving rook to e1 and perhaps later bring his knight into e5. He was also able to move his bishop around and attack black's pawn on d4 with his bishop and knight. So even though black had the two bishops here and a slight initiative, the game eventually ended in a draw. Now please return again to the position in diagram 5, see if we can do any better. In that position, black pawn to f4 looks a better shot at preventing white from occupying d4 effectively, whilst retaining the mobility of the black bishop at g7. So after black pawn to f4, white moves bishop to c5, attacking the rook. Black moves rook to e8, and now the white knight goes back to f3. White is here prepared to answer an invasion by the black rook onto e2 by moving his rook from f1 to e1, and then trying either to exchange the rooks or to get in on the 7th rank or the 8th rank. So instead of this immediate rook invasion, black could develop his bishop, move his bishop from c8, say, to f5, which attacks the weak pawn at d3. White will probably move his rook from f1 to d1. And now again, if black tries to come in on the 7th with his rook down onto e2, white will probably move his knight to d4. And once again, we've got an undesirable position for black. So instead of moving his rook into e2, perhaps black's best is to move his bishop from f5 to g4. And after rook to d2 by white, perhaps black should play bishop takes on f3. In this case, he will at least have created weaknesses on the white's kingside pawn structure, and this should give him a slight advantage, though not necessarily a winning one. Well, that's all the positions we'll be looking at on side 1. On side 2, we're going to go through a few more. You may wish to take a rest here and then come back to side 2. Positions for analysis, side 2. Now for a more light-headed position. This is position number 6. I'd like you to set it up on your boards. Now, in this position you're black, and you've got a good attack, but how do you carry on? Please switch off and consider how you would continue for black here. Well, if you win the queen for 2 rooks by rook takes pawn check, you're unlikely to win, because there are no white pawns to pick up, and no past black pawns to push through. If, on the other hand, from diagram 6, you play black queen to e4, white will probably exchange queens and then block the attack by rook to f2. Well, you can also try from diagram 6, black queen to d4 check. White king would move to h1, and now black rook to d3. But this can be met by white queen to f2, or even white queen to h5. In the latter case, the white queen can be particularly annoying with her threats against the h and f pawns. Let's reset some of these pieces. White king on g1, white queen on f3, black queen on b4, and black rook on d2. Another idea is to play rook on g8 to d8, taking advantage of the fact that white cannot challenge rooks on the d file with rook on a1 to d1 because of black queen to d4 check. But after rook g8 to d8, white could play simply king to h1. Now black rook from d8 to d3 looks very strong, doesn't it? But still, white queen to h5, black queen to e4, attacking the g pawn, and now white queen to g5. And it still isn't all that marvellous for black. As well as that, white is threatening to counterattack against black's king with his queen. So, let's return to diagram 6 and consider another move. The move played was black queen to c3. This just looks like a flashy move. Of course, white will not fall for a mate in 3 by playing queen takes queen, but plays the obvious white pawn to g3. This, however, is an important weakening of his king's position. Black moves queen to d4 check, white king to h1. If you hadn't got this far in your earlier analysis, please switch off and continue for the black attackers. As white is once more threatening to exchange pieces with rook from a1 to d1, black should not hang about. Queen to b2, if he plays, meets a just adequate response in white queen to h5. And black pawn to h5 seems a bit slow. The strongest in this position is black rook to c8. This threatens either to double on the 7th rank or to winkle the white queen off the long white diagonal by rook to c3. Once that queen goes off that diagonal, black will be able to deliver a check on d5 and then perhaps a mate. Now, if white answers rook c8 with rook a d1, then black simply plays rook from c8 to c2, white captures, and then black queen takes on d2 with a quick mate on h2 or g2. So, after black rook to c8, white played rook on a1 to c1. Black rook takes on c1, white rook takes on c1. Again, please switch off and play a move for black. Here black can win a pawn or two by playing queen to b2, threatening the rook and the h and the a pawn, but more consistent to take advantage of the weakness created by pawn to g3 is black rook to f2. White cannot move his queen because of black queen to d5 check and mate, so he must attack the black queen by rook to d1. Black retreats queen to c5, and white pawn to b4, trying once more to deflect the queen from the defense of the rook at f2. Black's reply is here queen to c2. And finally, white must let go of the long white diagonal and allow mate or worse. It's rather surprising that one pawn move, pawn to g3, caused so much trouble to white. In this case, in two directions, along the 7th rank and also along the central white diagonal. Now let's go on to diagram 7, and though it is black to play in this position, I'd like you to analyze it fairly objectively. So set diagram 7 up on your board, switch off and begin to analyze. There are really two moves for black in this position. He can play to win a pawn by black bishop takes on f3, or he can move his attacked knight. First we'll look at black bishop takes on f3. White recaptures, queen takes on f3, and black plays knight takes on e5. The analysis does not end here, because white has a pin by queen to g3. Queen g3. If you didn't see this, switch off and look at the position again. White queen to g3 looks pretty strong, because if the knight at e5 moves, white plays queen takes queen. You'll find this pin motif frequently turning up in Sicilian middle games, particularly Scheveningen Sicilians. After queen to g3, black could try knight to h5 here, trying to make use of a fork. After white plays queen takes knight, black queen takes queen, white rook takes queen, black pawn to bishop 3. But this idea does not profit him, because his king's pawn is unguarded, and white can simply play rook takes on e6, attacking the undefended bishop at e7. No, knight to h5 is no good. So let's return again to diagram 7. And now add the moves black bishop takes on f3, white queen takes on f3, black knight takes on e5, and now white queen to g3. Well, the next bit of tactics is black bishop to d6. White bishop takes on f6, which seems to win a piece because of the pin on the g-pawn. But black just plays knight to g6, blocking the mate threat and discovering an attack against the queen. White plays queen to f3, black pawn takes bishop, white queen takes on f6. You'll note here that white's knight on f1 serves a useful purpose, guarding the h-pawn against bishop takes h2 check. Your decision to play into this line or not probably depends on what you thought of this final position when you decided on bishop takes f3. In your analysis, you have to have seen at least this far when you choose bishop takes f3, and at this point concrete variations end and you assess the position. And how is it to be assessed? Well, black is certainly not winning here, because his king side is under some pressure, but I doubt if he is really losing either, if he continues with, say, bishop to e5 to g7, followed by occupying the queen file with his rooks, or advancing his queenside pawns to b4 to increase the scope of his bishop. But at first sight, the position looks rather poor for black. Please return your pieces again to diagram 7, switch off if necessary to do so. Now let's see what happens when black chooses his other move, which is knight to d5, which happens to defend the bishop on e7, of course. Please make that move on the board. And now choose a move for white. Switch off here and analyze the position after black knight to d5. Black's knight move is what you would call provocative, if it isn't a blunder. In the first place, it tries to provoke white into a classical Greek gift bishop sacrifice at h7, a sacrifice which often works when black is undeveloped. In this case, black is hoping the good development of his pieces, the bishop at b7 and the queen at c7, will counteract the strength of white's attack. So let's look at this line. After black knight to d5, white bishop takes on e7, black knight takes on e7, white bishop takes on h7 check. Here black king to h8 is not much use after white knight to g5, with threats of queen h5 to follow. So black must accept with king takes h7. White knight to g5, check. And here if black retreats to g8, then queen h5 is deadly. Why is that? This is because the pawn at e5 prevents black from putting a knight at f6 to guard h7. So to stop the mate, black will have to move his rook, say rook to e8, and then white will simply play queen takes f7 check, black king to h8, and then white knight takes on e6, threatening the queen and mate at g7. So, after knight to g5 check, that's diagram 8, if you can't remember the position, where would you move the black king to, g6 or h6? Well, what square did you decide to put the king on? If you go to g6, white may play queen to g4, and then black's standard reaction would be to play pawn to f5. I think in this position, white can either take the pawn off en passant, to which black will have to recapture with the knight, still retaining his attack against the white queen, and after that, probably the white's best is rook takes on e6, with a strong attack, though I'm not sure if it is crushing. Again, after black king to g6, white queen to g4, black pawn to f5, white could also consider moving his queen back to g3, and then if black plays pawn to f4, just moving the queen up to g4, again retaining his attacking position. The reason I'm not going to go into this line that deeply is that probably white has a strong Zwischenzug. This is an in-between move from diagram 8. So if you reset the position in diagram 8, we'll just look at that one. Right, if you got the position in diagram 8 and then play king to g6, I think white's strong in-between move is knight to g3. Actually, black cannot capture the knight on g5 because of queen to h5 check, and there should be a quick mate in the offing. I think in precisely 2 moves. No, queen h5 check, king f4, then queen to h4 mate. Yes, that's right. So, after knight to g3, black must play rook to h8, but now queen to g4 seems even stronger than in the last game because white has his knight in action. Then after queen to g4, if pawn to f5, white pawn takes on f6, black knight takes on f6, and once again white rook takes on e6. In this position, I would tend to think that black is lost, because white can bring all his pieces into the attack against the king. Now, please return again to diagram 8. After white knight to g6, g5 check, black may also play king to h6. Here, white has again his in-between move, knight to g3, to which black replies pawn to g6. White moves queen to g4, with the threat of queen to h4 check, and queen to h7 mate. Once again, please turn off your tapes and come to a decision about the position. Let's consider 4 possible black tries. Black knight to f5, black knight takes on e5, black rook to h8, and black king to g7. First, black knight to f5 gets mated. After white knight takes on f5 check, g takes f5, white queen to h4 check, and black king to g6. I think white has a mate in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 moves from this position. I'll leave you to make the mating moves yourself. So black knight to f5 ends in mate. Back now to the position in diagram 10. Next move is black knight takes on e5. This allows queen to h4 check, king to g7, queen h7 check, king to f6, knight g5 to e4 check, black bishop takes on e4, white knight takes on e4 check, black king to f5, white queen back to h3 check, black knight to g4, white queen to f3 check, black queen to f4, white knight to d6 check, black king to g5, a white pawn to h4 check, which wins white's queen for a start. Let's return again now to diagram 10. Black in this position can also jettison material by rook to h8. A simple line for white is knight takes f7 check, king g7, knight takes h8, rook takes h8, and then queen takes e6. White has got a rook and 3 pawns against 2 pieces, so he should have the advantage here. Now, again from diagram 10, we'll look at black's other try, which is black king back to g7. If this was not your choice previously, please switch off here and analyze its consequences. White might possibly try queen takes king's pawn here, aiming to obtain 3 pawns for the piece after pawn takes queen, knight takes pawn check, and knight takes queen. But I think black should be okay in that ending. The other white move in reply to king g7 from diagram 10 is knight to h5 check. If then pawn takes knight, knight takes e6 double check leads to mate. So, after knight to h5 check, black must retreat his king. How would you place that king? Have you decided? Black king h6 looks good at first sight, but white has a very strong answer there. That is queen to f4. Well, he has other moves, but queen to f4 looks very strong because it threatens both knight takes f7, double check, and also knight takes on e6, discovered check against the black queen. So, from the position in diagram 10 after black king to g7, white knight to h5 check, I don't think king to h6 is okay. Again, king to h8 is another possibility. And then against that, I think knight to f6 is not so strong if black plays knight takes e5. But white does have a crusher against king to h8, and that is queen to h3. And then if black takes on e5, white moves his knight back to g3 discovered check, and we transpose into a variation already analyzed. So return once more to diagram 10, adding the moves king g7 and knight h5 check, and play here king to g8. This analysis is rather like one of those king and pawn endings, when you have to place your king on the right square. If king to g8, then white knight to f6 check, black king to g7, isn't such a clear continuation for white. But what about, instead of knight to f6 check, what if white plays queen to h3? Did you consider this move? If not, please switch off and analyze a reply for black, if there is one. What did you think of? After white queen to h3, then knight takes e5 is possible, but then white would simply retreat his knight back to g3, and we're back in a variation we've already looked at. So what is there? How about trying knight on e7 to d5? This plans to answer white knight to g3 with knight from d5 to f6. Then if white pawn takes on f6, black knight takes on f6, and the net result is even material. So it seems from this analysis that black's game, though difficult, is not as indefensible as would appear at first sight. You may quite likely find a hole in my analysis, and if so, please write a letter to me to tell me, in which case I'll erase the offending area on the cassette. Now a general question. How much of this should one expect to see in over-the-board play? Should one play it all by ear, or try and work out everything to the last detail? This is a very important point, and I'll first state that in over-the-board play one is limited to having only a certain amount of time to make one's moves. And therefore you should play sensibly and make it your aim rarely to get into time trouble. When you consider that most blunders are made in time trouble, then it clearly is a luxury you cannot afford. In the particular position we have just been analysing, you could not hope to analyse all the lines starting from scratch, but if you reach a similar position in your own games, you will now have some background knowledge which will help you to assess the soundness or otherwise of the sacrifice. In the actual game, I doubt if either side analysed the consequences of it very deeply. Black considered it sufficiently unclear to be worth dangling in White's face, and as for White, he found a stronger continuation, which did not require any sacrifice of material. So, please return again to diagram 7 and add the move Black Knight to d5. As I said, Black Knight d5 was provocative, but it didn't provoke White into a sacrifice at h7. Instead he played pawn to c4, threatening to capture on e7 if Black moves his knight away. Black has no choice. He must go bishop takes g5, White knight takes g5, and now Black knight to f4. White bishop took on h7 check, Black king to h8. Would you care to switch off again and think of a move for White? It's diagram 11. If you chose the obvious White queen to g4, you get no marks. Black plays knight takes e5, and then if White moves queen to h4, Black knight takes g2 is embarrassing. If on the other hand, White captures on f4, queen takes knight, then Black knight to f3 check wins his queen. From diagram 11, you might also have chosen White bishop to e4, but then Black has another trick. Knight takes e5, White bishop takes b7, and if now White rook takes e5, queen takes g2 is mate. Well, instead of queen to g4 or bishop to e4, from diagram 11, White played pawn to g3, which looks dangerous, because were it not for the White knight at g5, Black would himself be able to deliver mate on h3 with his knight. Again, Black seems to be able to play queen c6 with a mating threat, but White can easily answer that with bishop to e4. So, after pawn to g3, all Black could think of was pawn to f6. White pawn takes on f4, Black pawn takes on g5, White queen to h5. Since White threatens here mate in 2 by bishop to g6 check, Black makes an escape for his king by rook takes f4. But it is not sufficient. How would you finish off here? White moved bishop to f5 check, king to g8, bishop takes e6 check, king to f8, queen to h8 check, king e7, queen takes g7 check, Black king took on e6, queen g6 check, Black king to e7, White queen takes on g5 check, winning the rook, and shortly the game.